colleague, Professor Heinz KURZ. Dear Heinz, nice to see you. Thank you very much for making the time. I hope that you hear us well. I think it's a great privilege and honor to welcome Professor KURZ. Professor KURZ, I think, needs no introduction. He's probably one of the most prominent now living historians of economic thought. It's not a piece of rhetoric. Just according to the results of my personal surveys of the Russian historians of economic thought, Professor KURZ is viewed as one of the most remarkable scholars in this field. Numerous academic awards and titles received by Professor KURZ also speak that we have before us an absolutely unique scholar. It's enough to know that Professor KURZ is the former president of the European Association of the History of Economic Thought and the director of the Graz Schumpeter Center. And in the context of our conference, I think it's especially important to say that Professor KURZ is a fine expert in classical economics and especially in Adam Smith's work. And I think that practically everyone in this room knows the wonderful book, Innovation, Knowledge and Growth, Adam Smith, Schumpeter, and the Moderns, written by Professor KURZ. So I think I can talk about the scientific work of Professor KURZ endlessly, but I think it will be better to let him to speak for himself. Dear Heinz, the floor is yours. You have about half an hour.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Alexander, for this extremely kind introduction. My talk today is about Adam Smith on the process of civilization and its hazards. Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
You can see it, very good.
Yes.
That is in good order. We can then start it. Well, the entire talk is about Adam Smith, of course, on the occasion of the tercentenary of his birth, that is 300 years ago. But what I want to say today shows that his work is still of importance and we can learn a lot from him. Of course, some of the ideas there are contingent, historically contingent, but others have a bearing and a meaning much beyond the time in which Adam Smith lived. Now, what I'm going to say is exclusively, almost exclusively, about Adam Smith. And not about any other things in this world today or yesterday or the day before yesterday. It's just about Adam Smith. And what I insist is that what I present you is all to be found in him and in his works. Now, the main work, of course, I'm interested in is The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776. And here is the contents of my talk. After an introduction, a fairly long one, I will talk about Smith, evolutionary economist ante litteram, because I claim that he was indeed a very early scholar with evolutionary ideas. I will then talk about Smith's analysis of the process of civilization, then hazards endangering the process, and conclude with a short note on the immortal Adam Smith. Let me ask you, can you understand me well or is it difficult?
Yes.
You can understand me. Okay, very good. So now let us briefly try to find out when did he write. Now there is a diagram which has on one axis time, starting 9,000 before Christ up to more or less present days. It's a nice diagram by Vogel, the economic historian. And on the other axis, you have world population. Now you can see there's a kink in that curve that shows the development. And that kink is basically the time when Smith wrote. So when the process started, that is economic growth and development, prior to that, there was, of course, growth and development, but to a much lesser extent than now. And you can also see how important technological breakthroughs were. This just to keep in mind at the back of our minds for the rest. Now, I would say the fate of all great authors in the social sciences is to be misunderstood, misinterpreted, their ideas captured, and politically and economically abused. This applies to Schumpeter, to Marx, to Keynes, and also to Smith. And Smith was someone who could write very well. He was trained in rhetoric and in literature, and therefore you find many catchy phrases in his work which could easily be picked up and used for all kinds of purposes. Now, I will focus in my talk on some highly misleading interpretations of Adam Smith and on aspects of his doctrine that are typically neglected. So you cannot expect from my talk a balanced view of the entire work. How could that possibly be in 30 minutes? Now, first myth I would like to mention is the following one. Smith is said to have argued that nothing but selfishness is necessary to yield socially beneficial outcomes. I quote here Andrew Schotter, the game theorist, and of course, this is completely false. Perhaps Mondeville was of this opinion, but not Smith. Smith was very clear that the non-intended consequences of purposeful human action may be either advantageous or neutral or harmful. Their impact, he pointed out, moreover, is contingent and depends upon laws, rules, and institutions and the quality of government. Therefore, The Wealth of Nations is essentially a book for legislators and statesmen that should guide them in their economic and social policies. So economic policy is important because otherwise you might run into difficulties and the harmful effects of purposeful human actions, of selfish actions, may be dominant. What is also important to see in Smith is that some consequences become apparent only much later, making it inherently difficult, if not impossible, to pass judgments on them now. So, what are the long-term consequences of certain actions? And the conclusion of this is, and I think this is to be found all over Smith's work, is try to be prudent, cautious, and open-minded, and try to be a part of the commonwealth of all sensitive and rational beings, as he called himself and others. Now, Smith's main theme is the process of civilization. And the question, of course, is, once put on track, will this process incessantly lead society towards equality, liberty, and justice? Will it establish the obvious and simple system of natural liberty and bring about the greatest happiness of the greatest number? A phrase coined by his former teacher Hutcheson, not Bentham as it is occasionally said. Now, of course, what does Smith mean by equality, liberty, and justice? He does not mean by equality that, for example, all people should get the same pay. No, not at all, not at all. But he asks for a situation in which people ought to be having the same rights and the same obligations, or at least similar rights and similar obligations. That is a criterion that was very important for him. Liberty. People should be free in their actions unless their actions include harm for others. And what about justice? Well, I mean, justice is an issue of great importance to Smith, because without justice, society cannot exist for long. It is bound to founder. Is it enough to entrust a larger part of the economy to markets and reduce the role of state and government? Again, no, this is not the case, as we shall see in a minute. The state has an important role in its entire construction. And are there dangers and hazards that may terminate and even reverse the process of civilization? And we shall see that while some people, some interpreters think that once put on track, the process of civilization will carry on forever. This is not the case. There are these dangers and hazards, and you should always be on the alert and try to fight them in order to preserve that process. So, was Smith an optimist as regards the process of civilization? I think the answer is he was, and he wasn't. This is, of course, a Sibylline formulation, but it will become clear in the following what I mean. He might be called a Darwinian, not a Spencerian. In evolutionary economics, Darwin is a much more cautious man, not arguing that, development will be always forward and to the better and to so on and so forth. Whereas Spencer thought it's just a success story from beginning to end, Smith was not. But how could he be a Darwinian, in my interpretation, long before Darwin was born? Now, this leads me to a few remarks on Smith's evolutionary economist ante litteram. Now, interestingly enough, if you read Smith, I think you will hopefully agree with me that he conceptualized society as an evolving system. And he studied, in the first place, the static properties at a given moment of time in terms of the long period method. This is a method which focuses on the determination of natural prices as the centers of gravitation of market prices. And in a second step, he then sought to grasp the endogenous evolutionary dynamics that emerge from within the system. The endogenous evolutionary dynamics. Where does society go if it is left to its own devices? In a third step, he tried to identify the particular forces that prompt the self-transformation of economy, society, culture, politics, religion, people's aspirations, motivations, and mindsets, social psychology, etc. I think this is important. In Smith, you see the entire social corpus and the beliefs of people, even their religions, are affected by this dynamism. Nothing stays as it was and used to be. Everything changes. And of course, Smith was very well versed in history. He saw that this is reflected in historical facts, but he was also familiar with the work of a Frenchman by the name of Georges-Louis Leclerc, Comte de Buffon. This gentleman had published altogether almost 50 volumes on natural philosophy. And the first 3 volumes, there's the title of the book, were published in 1749. They included a Théorie de la Terre, theory of the earth, a Histoire générale des animaux, a history of animals, and a Histoire naturelle de l'homme, a history of man. He was an early proponent of a biological theory of evolution, you could say 100 years before Darwin, and he argued basically that nature and its inhabitants are not static entities. They rather evolve over time, forming a progressive evolutionary sequence. For example, the idea that the ape is a yet undeveloped form of a human being is to be found in Leclerc. Now, strangely enough, Smith quotes Leclerc in The Wealth of Nations and also elsewhere, not very often, but this is overlooked by many interpreters, but I think it is important, and perhaps you will agree with me in case you look more intensively into the matter. Now, what we find in Leclerc is, amongst other things, also a discussion of the implication of human actions on the living conditions on the planet. And he anticipates, you could say, the Anthropocene to some extent. He saw, for example, that burning woods, deforestation in North America changes local microclimates, etc., etc. Smith was very, he admired Leclerc a lot and called him an almost universally merciful, meritful man. Actually, the Histoire was as successful, or almost as successful, as Diderot's Encyclopédie. It was translated, at least some of its volumes, into Russian. You may check this in your libraries. Now, Smith's analysis of the process of civilization and the evolutionary process. According to Smith, economy, society, culture, and politics are in perpetual motion. We are concerned with a restless system in which intended and unintended consequences of human action interact in an often complex way. And you may recall in the Scottish Enlightenment, this problem of intended and unintended consequences is a central issue. It is wrong to assume that humans are capable of forecasting completely the results of their actions and deeds. Very often, surprise is important, and very often, so to speak, your plans are not successful. He also focused attention on competition. That's the mechanism, the selective mechanism in the system. Competition means rivalry and forces producers to continuously introduce improvements. That's his term for what we now call perhaps innovations. And these innovations in turn force producers, other producers, to respond in terms of adopting, adapting, imitating, innovating themselves. And therefore the system revolutionizes its productive structure and beyond. It's a competitive selection process. Smith is an early advocate of an evolutionary economic theory of history. He tries to understand economic history first and foremost in terms of economic principles, because much of the change that is triggered in society comes from the economy, and one has to understand what the effects are within the economy, but much beyond in other parts of the social system. And if you look at Marx and Schumpeter, you will see how much they benefited from him. Now, there are indications of Smith's evolutionism, if you wish. There is the combinatorial metaphor. He understands technological change, innovations, as a process where given particles of knowledge are recombined to form new particles. He also has a view that not all innovations really materialize. Some fall flat to the ground, and people who engage in them make losses. So you could say it is like in biological evolution, mutations. Several mutations fail, and some innovations fail. So there is, you could say, a certain parallel. And most importantly, he was of the opinion that the system is characterized by circular and cumulative causation, which involves nonlinear dynamics, to put it in our words, dynamically increasing returns. Alan Young puts it that way. Smith's central theorem is one of the most illuminating and fruitful generalizations in economics. The division of labor and technological evolution propagate themselves in a self-reinforcing way, leading to sustained change. Now, there is technical change all the time. There is science which plays an important role. It is become a part of the division of labor. It is, so to speak, the result of that process that has been triggered. And Smith, interestingly enough, writes that a society's productivity and affluence hinge essentially upon the quantity of science at its disposal. I mean, this is a long time before the concept of a knowledge society has been coined. The concept that change in the system emerges from small variations, an innovation here, an improvement there, but they then are getting multiplied via imitation, etc., etc. And therefore you are in a system in which you have essentially unpredictable outcomes of all this process, with uncertainty playing an important role. And therefore, I think his view is incompatible with any theological perspective on human history. Searching for an objective sense of history, see Hegel and also Marx, I think, according to Smith, is a metaphysical prejudice. That is my interpretation, but you can find passages in which he says that. Now, what is that process of development? Can it be subdivided in periods? And indeed, you find in Smith a system of stages of development, starting with the nation of hunters and gatherers, then shepherds, then farmers, and finally, so to speak, the society focuses attention on a system of interdependent production with a deepening social division of labor, growing domestic and foreign trade, etc., a commercial society. Marx later used capitalism, so did Schumpeter. The stages are defined in terms of modes and relations of production. What are the kind of productive activities? Who are the agents of production? What are the property rights? What are the access costs to resources? What are the institutions? What is the degree of monetization? So they are not simple things. They are all defined with respect to a number of characteristic features. And he also points out, if we talk about, riches, wealth of nations, etc., there are three principal sources of riches and rising wealth. The first one is conquest of other countries, robbery and tribute payments by subjugated peoples. The second is trade and advantageous exchange. The third one, developing the industry and diligence of productive workers via deepening social division of labor. And he's very clear that the conquest plays a very, very important role at the beginning of the development, when productivity was low and the survival of societies was time and again in difficulty. So people tried to survive by just attacking others, robbing and tribute payments. But he's not of the opinion that it is only to be found in the early stages of society. Trade and advantageous exchange, of course, is essentially the mercantile period, but also modernity. And three, developing the industry and diligence, that is the commercial society, of course. Now, a crucial question is, was in modern times imperialism, as it is very often called, an atavism, as Schumpeter argued, for example, when seen against the process of rationalization, as Max Weber pointed out, which society has been undergoing for millennia, echoing past obsolete modes of aspiration, motivation, and behavior. I will briefly talk about this later. Now, Smith's attention focuses, as I said, on the commercial society, and this is essentially a class society made up of three major classes: workers, merchants, capitalists, manufacturers, so the owners of physical and financial capital, and landlords, the owners of resources, land, and so on and so forth. Now, Smith defines these classes in terms of various characteristic features, and they are parallel to one another, if you look at it carefully. First, of course, the property they possess. Workers possess only labor power, capitalists real and financial capital, landlords landed property, mines, and other natural resources. But in parallel, he discusses their access to information and knowledge. And his argument is workers very little, almost none. Landlords some, but they are not very much interested, because the way of life where income comes without any effort makes them lazy. But capitalists, merchants, etc., they are continuously making plans. They try to understand the world. They know their own interests, and they have access to information and knowledge beyond many others, not to speak, of course, of scientists, etc. Now, the understanding of their own interests, that is also an important part. Workers don't understand their interests. That is Smith's thesis. Very often they don't. And those of the polity, they don't understand what is going on in society at large. Again, those, making plans, economic plans, are better in this regard. And they are also better in their capacity to participate in social life. And then, of course, there's the question, is there a connection of a particular interest of workers, capitalists, landlords, and the interests of society at large, and Smith is very clear that, I mean, the main interests of society that must be looked after, because it's the plenitude, it's the largest part of the society, is workers. I quickly enter into that. I mean, workers, he argues, are vulnerable to manipulation and can easily be exploited because they know so little. They can be pulled over the barrel, to use a proverb. He writes, the public deliberation, therefore, the workers' voice is little heard and less regarded, except upon some particular occasions when his clamor is animated, not for his, but for their own particular purposes, merchants, etc., etc. There are orders of men, he insists, whose interest is never exactly the same with that of the public, who have generally an interest to deceive and even to oppress the public, and who accordingly have upon many occasions both deceived and oppressed it. Now, obviously, a major task of political economy, according to Adam Smith, is to expose and unmask the particular economic and political interests of some people that claim to advocate the public interest or public interests. That's a major issue. You see, you have to show that what pretends to be a public interest is actually a private one, a special one. Now, in the limelight are workers and their families, and one must be careful that they are participating in life, because no society can surely be flourishing and happy of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable. And actually, if you look carefully, Smith is very much interested in economic growth and development. Why is that so? Because he thinks that in certain circumstances, if the rate of capital accumulation and therefore the rate of growth of the economy, it engenders a high rate of growth of the effectual demand for hands. And if that effectual demand for hands grows more swiftly than the rate of procreation of the working population, then this means that firms, that masters bid up wages. That's his hope and expectation. And therefore, the process of civilization, from the material-based point of view, is very much a question of economic growth and development. Now, there's a problem, Smith. Capital accumulation, innovations propel growth, but he has some limits in his analysis. It's his physiocratic prejudice. He argues that agriculture is the most productive sector, since nature labors for free with workers, a thing which Ricardo criticized with a vengeance. And his claim, on the other hand, which is contradictory to the former one, that manufacturers offer the largest opportunities for the deepening division of labor and productivity increases. Now, if manufacturing has high productivity increases, why should their agriculture in the long run still be more productive than agriculture? Smith was of the opinion that basically corn is the only, using a term Schaffer coined, basic commodity in the system. It's needed directly and indirectly everywhere. Not so, for example, iron or energy, and therefore he did not really understand that manufacturing could become the engine of growth. Now, the next thing is, of course, does the process of commercialization have only good effects, or also what he calls bad effects? His terminology. Now, he thinks it has also bad effects because it favors a crematistic spirit, money making, fosters the principle of avarice, his term, and spreads hedonism. By having their minds constantly employed on the arts of luxury, people grow effeminate and dastardly, lazy, and unwilling to act in favor of the public purpose. And therefore, there is a danger, whilst in a feudal society, nothing was honorable but war. In a commercial society, large parts of the population can gain their reputation by other means than going out for war. It became inconvenient for the rich to go out to war. The merchant who can make £2,000 or £3,000 at home will not incline to go out to war, but it was an amusement to an ancient king who had nothing else ado. And there is another effect of commercialization, Smith points out. It sinks the courage of mankind and tends to extinguish martial spirit. So you have other possibilities to become successful in society than as a warlord. Now, socio-economic development, as you can see, comes with different trends and tendencies. That is very important. That's the crucial element of its evolutionary approach. And these need not be in harmony with one another, but they may be antagonistic to one another. Therefore, a crucial task of political economy is to identify tensions between these tendencies and suggest measures that contain the negative ones and support the positive ones. The process of civilization, according to Smith, must be protected, cared, and tended at all times. It is always at the risk of being terminated. Now, what are the major hazards? I must run through because time is short. Now, the first one is, of course, what he wrote. I mean, if large parts of society, the laboring poor, as he also calls them, if due to the division of labor, their mental and moral impoverishment continues, if the diskilling bias of the deepening social division of labor is negative, then, of course, how can they ever cope with the growing complexity of social relations, a growing network of interdependencies? And therefore, workers are more and more vulnerable to deception. Smith writes, they tend, that is the danger, to get as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become, unable to form any just judgment concerning many even of the ordinary duties of private life, not to speak of public collective duties. Now, the next thing is, of course, Smith argues, in modern times, this was his criticism of the mercantile system, in modern times there is still, the wretched spirit of monopoly. Capitalists do not like competition. They would prefer to be in a monopolistic situation. And therefore, they very often form coalitions with other merchants, manufacturers, and also civil servants. And corruption plays an important role because investing in privileges and monopolies by public authorities and restricting competition may be more profitable than investing in innovations. But Smith insisted monopolies ought to be contestable because monopoly is a great enemy to good management, whereas free and universal competition forces everybody to have recourse to it for the sake of self-defense. So he's very much in favor of competition and sees the danger that the old spirit of monopoly still is of great importance. The third thing is, Smith must ask, of course, the question, is the market economy, interdependent market, is it stable? And what he puts forward, interestingly enough, is an argument, yes, up to a point, and no in certain areas. Yes, in product markets, because in product markets, he points out, there are positive feedback effects. If, for example, the price of a commodity increases, there are negative feedback effects. If the price of a commodity increases, then, of course, output will increase. Capital will move into that sector, which implies that in the medium run, the market price will go down again. Whereas in financial markets, if the price of an asset goes up, this might involve the view that there is further increases to be expected. Therefore, people buy the asset and the price goes up, there is self-fulfilling prophecies, and you may run into a bubble. That is to say, Smith identified very clearly the problems of asymmetric information, moral hazard, and adverse selection. The banking sector, he pointed out, badly needs regulation. These may be considered a violation of natural liberty, but those exertions of the natural liberty of a few individuals which might endanger the security of the whole society are and ought to be restrained by the laws of all governments. Do I have another 3 minutes?
Sure.
Yeah, okay. So there ought to be, so Smith, I mean, if you read what Smith had to say about the instability of the financial sector, the 2008 crisis would not come as a surprise to you. And so to speak, liberalizing that sector was a major fault carried out by many governments. And Smith knew better. He had actually as his experience the collapse of Scottish banks, and in particular of the Banque de France, when paper money was introduced, and John Law was the advisor to the French government. Nowadays, finally, politicians. I mean, can we trust on politicians? And Smith has, on the whole, a fairly bad view of politicians. He's convinced that if you want to entrust the fate of an entire nation to some politicians, they ought to have characteristic features which are very demanding. First of all, they ought to have a solid knowledge in various fields, including history, law, philosophy, ethics, and in particular political economy. They ought to have a quick perception and sober judgment. They ought to have the capability to select good aides and counsels and important virtues. Now, when Smith was on the grand tour with the son of the Duke of Buccleuch, I mean, this was his task, I mean, to introduce this man to those requirements which he felt were important, but he eventually, although he learned a lot, the young Duke, he didn't become a politician for reasons we cannot go into. Smith himself called politicians insidious and crafty animals, very clever with regard to their own interests. He questioned their probity and honesty. They are not always really clear to the people. He referred to their avarice and injustice, often abusing the confidence of their subjects. Now, of course, he had a lot of experience also via David Hume, his friend, who had written a huge history about England and gone through cascades of politicians. Now, the fifth and very important thing is, Smith pointed out that defense is more importance than opulence. Now, this is a peculiar argument by someone who is said to be only in favor of markets. This is not the case, because Smith was of the opinion, because of the different trends and tendencies, developed economies, rich economies, are in danger of getting attacked by poorer ones, but ones that are more endowed with martial spirit and soldierly virtues. Whereas in modern society, with its hedonistic and crematistic attitudes, that is a problem. So in peacetime, preparing the military force and employing it in time of war is very different, he insists, in the different states of society, in the different periods of improvement. And therefore, in advanced societies, he calls the wisdom of the state as absolutely needed in order to ward off a danger from being invaded and subjugated by other nations. Now, I think I don't have the time to go into details. Here is just a quotation. which says what he sees, so to speak, different rates of development and different paths of development cause tensions between nations, which occasionally lead to wars between those nations, where some which are less well off try to capture the riches of the others. Therefore, the system of natural liberty is seriously in danger of falling victim to tendencies it generates itself. You see, it's an endogenous process. Let me just immediately come to the final part. This is known as the Thucydides trap, according to Adam Smith. You are aware of the famous story about the Peloponnese War. The rise of Athens brought about fear of the martial city-state of Sparta of getting superseded. This resulted in the Peloponnesian War that lasted for 27 years, and Thucydides, whom Smith admired greatly and read intensively, he pointed out that, I mean, this was due to indeed the danger felt by Sparta. In the end, interestingly enough, Sparta won, but at a huge cost. Both parties were completely exhausted and lost relative to other powers in the neighborhood. So let me go to my final statement, namely the immortal, the immortal Adam Smith. The wealth of nations is meant to assist legislators and statesmen in terms of sound economic principles, which, if enacted into law and implemented in terms of economic and social policies, would support the process of civilization. It would enrich both the people and the state and defend the nation's achievements against all odds and enemies. And a great problem in Smith, which you find throughout the work, is an uneven distribution of innovation, knowledge, and understanding, which can be used and misused. Thank you so much indeed for your attention.
Thank you, dear Heinz. Unfortunately, the schedule is very tight and we practically don't have any time for questions. Probably I will ask one. Yes, Heinz, please. Probably the question is the followers. It's a bit strange question, but what should we learn as modern economists from Adam Smith? What would he recommend us to study, and in which way?
Well, I think you should understand, first of all, that we are confronted with very complex issues, first. Secondly, these complex issues are subject to endogenous changes, which lead to a self-transformation of society. So you should be aware of this. Now, given the complexity, you should also be very, very cautious in not pretending to know too much. Our minds are rather limited in understanding a world that is getting more and more complex. Therefore, try to be reluctant, jumping on simple answers to those concept questions, and be aware of the fact that at any time there are unintended consequences, and occasionally they may be more important than the intended ones. And therefore be on the outlook for those unintended consequences. Climate change, warming of the planet, they were never intended by anyone, I think, at large measure. But they happen nevertheless. So, basically, what you should learn from Smith is try to deal with that complexity in a very circumvent way. That's, I think, important. And read his analysis of private interests versus the public interest. I think it's important, and the role of the state, it is rubbish to argue, as some people do, eliminate the state and everything will be fine. You do not eliminate power, because there are still people very powerful, and Smith agreed with Thomas Hobbes that wealth is power. So if you have an agglomeration of a lot of power, that may be a problem for society at large.
Thank you, Heinz, for your insightful answer. Probably one more question. Yes, Professor Ananin will ask. Probably Oleg Grigorьевich, it's more convenient his desk here.
I listen.
Okay. Dear Heinz, my best regards. I'm glad to hear you. And I have actually two questions. One question, you confined yourself to wealth of nations almost entirely. Why not a word about theory of moral sentiments? And the second question is, you used such a phrase, economic theory of history. What is the role of pure economic theory in Adam Smith, in this theory of history? Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for your interesting questions. I think if I had more time, you would have seen that the theory of moral sentiments plays an important role in my argument, because many of the things he writes about statesmen, legislators, politicians, etc., refer to the theory of moral sentiments, and in some of the quotations you would have seen that. But it is true, my focus of attention was the wealth of nations, which contains, and this leads me to your second question, which contains Smith's attempt of creating such an economic theory or analysis to understand historical events. I mean, let me just paraphrase this in terms of how he discusses the fall of feudalism and the rise of the commercial society. He understood very well that, I mean, this is not just a thing which is done by clicking your fingers, but something must have happened. And the argument he produces is this had a lot to do with innovations of luxury goods. Luxury goods produced abroad, and in England the barons were very keen to get those luxury goods. They were educated, so to speak, as the feudal class was, and they were interested in showing their riches in parade of riches, as Smith called them. Now, in order to have this parade of riches, you must be able to impress your neighbors by big festivals, etc. I mean, parties and so on and so forth, but also these luxury goods. So he writes, they sold all their might and power for those luxury goods. Now, the demand for luxury goods went up to such an extent that indeed there was import substitution by local manufacturers. They tried to imitate those luxury goods and sell them to the barons. The barons bought them. The new class of rising manufacturers, they won in political power, whereas the landlords lost. So you have a gradual transition towards the modern society. So that is the kind of theory he tried to build. What are the implications of what at first looks quite insignificant in the long run, if you see you have imitation and dynamic processes that completely change the social structure and the tensions that exist between the different classes? But thanks for your questions.
Thank you, Heinz. Dear Professor KURZ, once again, many thanks for making the time. The fact that you are just here is a real honor and great privilege for us. I think we could listen to you endlessly, but unfortunately, it's high time to start the next session. And
Sure.
Hope to see you soon at one or another conference. Thank you, Heinz.
So do I.
Thank you,
and please forgive me for not staying with you, because my Russian is unfortunately too rusty. I would not be able to follow you. I wish you all the best.
Thank you
so much for inviting me.
Thank you very
all
much.
the best. Bye-bye.